Now, the topic I'm speaking about today is when are ministers evidence-led? I asked to speak about the role of knowledge and creativity, and the organisers of Research Ed said, no, we want to know when are ministers interested in evidence. And I said, OK, thinking nothing of it. And I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for ensuring I have a lot to talk about today. Now, there are times when ministers are uninterested in evidence, and you would be too if you were the minister. Issues such as, should students study history until the age of 16 or not, are not issues on which there is an obvious evidence base that anyone can use. Those issues are rightly political. In New Zealand, for example, history does not exist as a separate subject. It's part of a wider humanities group. There's nothing right or wrong about that. There's no obvious way to bring evidence to bear. That's why we have democracy. Ministers are elected, MPs are elected. It is for us to decide what sort of government we want. At the opposite extreme, there are issues in which ministers are categorically and absolutely evidence-driven. Asbestos in schools. No minister has ever said, I don't care what the evidence says on asbestos, I think. And nor can I imagine any minister would ever do that. A year ago, we had an outbreak of something or other nasty in the water at Blackpool, and I sat through any number of meetings with Public Health England, United Utilities, etc., in Cobra, in the basement of the Cabinet Office, thinking through what to do with that. And you know what? If Public Health England say to me as Chief Scientific Advisor at the DFE, you should shut your schools, guess what? I'm going to tell ministers, you should shut your schools. Children may die. And you know what? If that's the case, ministers will say, OK, we'll do that. There's no way a minister on a public health issue like that would do anything other than be 100% evidence-led. Nick Gibbs, standing on this very spot, actually he stood here, Nick Gibbs standing almost on this very spot this morning, said that we will create 100,000 new school places a year for the rest of this Parliament. And you know why? Because there's 100,000 more children. That's a very evidence-led decision. You've got more children, you provide more schools. We don't say, we'll have a lottery as to which children can go to school. We'll have an RCT as to whether we need some education after all. No. If there are more pupils, we build more schools. Where do we build them? Where the pupils are. What do? We ask the local authorities, do you have more children? They tell us how many more children, and we send them a cheque, pretty much by return. It's not much more sophisticated than that. That is evidence-based policy making. And that's why you don't find huge areas that are just short of schools. Sometimes it's touch and go if a lot of people move into an area at the last moment. But you know what? We manage to provide the number of school places that are needed because ministers and the civil service are evidence-led on a range of really critical issues. There's then a whole bunch of issues that I would describe as evidence-informed. So the creation of Teach First. Nobody knew whether Teach First would work until we did it. But there was some evidence from the United States that Teach for America had been successful. The evidence wasn't so certain that we could say this is a slam dunk success, but there was enough of an evidence base for ministers to say, let's go for it, let's try it, let's see if it works. The work by Becky Allen, entirely independent work, has suggested that it does work. And so we've built on an evidence base as well as doing something that initially had some sort of evidence base. Universal infant free school meals, a policy brought in by the last government, has an evidence base. The Institute for Fiscal Studies work, looking at the pilots of universal infant free school meals under the previous Labour administration, found that they raised attainment. The government saw that evidence. They created the universal infant free school meals policy. There were many, many issues like that. The literacy hour had an evidence base. Phonics has an evidence base. Of course, people will argue as to whether the evidence base is strong enough, but there is an evidence base. Progress 8, the ending of the C grade in English and Maths, is a specific example of where outsiders change government policy. Those of you who study your government consultation documents in great detail will know that we originally suggested that we would evaluate secondary schools on a progress measure plus a C grade threshold in English and Maths. We consulted on it. Every single one of the maths organisations wrote in pleading with us not to have a C grade threshold in maths. They said it was distorting maths teaching, that it was leading not to the teaching of maths but to the teaching to the test. And all 5 of them wrote in, they gave examples, they provided evidence, and the government listened. And we changed our position from the consultation document to the final decision, and we got rid of that C threshold in English and maths because outsiders wrote in. Not random outsiders, but outsiders who we felt knew the evidence, who knew what they were talking about. So to people who say, is this consultation a fake? I can tell you, no. Consultations are never a fake. Of course, ministers go out with an idea that they believe in, but do they listen to the evidence? Absolutely. I personally, as chief analyst, read all 1,400 secondary accountability consultation responses and all 1,800 primary ones. That took a long time, I can tell you, although some of them are very short. Some of them, it says, do you think we should do this? And someone writes, no, and then sends it in. That is not the best way to influence ministers. If you want to influence ministers, if you're from the world of education, you should state who you are and why you should be listened to. That increases the sort of value and validity of your thing. And then you should explain in your own words, with evidence and examples, why you are putting forward the point of view you are putting forward. Those are the ones that get noticed by the civil servants. Those are the ones that individually are more likely to end up in front of the minister. Let's be honest, ministers are busy. They are not going to read 1,400 submissions. That is not a practical approach. Some things are evidence creating. The pupil premium, there is evidence in favour of it. We know that money matters. Work by people like Steve Gibbons at the London School of Economics tells us that school funding matters. But the pupil premium has then gone on to create an evidence base about whether it works, and then, via the EEF, about how it can be used most effectively. So policy can sometimes lead to the creation of the evidence that then allows the policy to be evaluated later on. The Innovation Fund that we've recently announced in children's social care is designed exactly like that. A large amount of money being put forward to try out lots of things for which there isn't a whole lot of evidence base ex ante, but sometimes the only thing you can do is to try it, but then evaluate it rigorously afterwards, shut it down if it doesn't work, roll it out if it does. And actually, DFE within government, that innovation programme, puts us at the forefront, I think, of government policy and government policy making. The EBAC for All is another policy that didn't have as strong an evidence base early on, but whose introduction is creating an evidence base. Becky Allen's work has shown, as Nick Gibbs said here earlier today, that those schools that have moved to a more EBAC-intensive curriculum have seen rises in English and maths grades. Now, our best guess, we haven't done deep dives to look at these schools, our best guess is that studying things like history and geography are getting you to read and write day in, day out, and for a bigger portion of the day, and that has what economists call externalities, knock-on effects on your ability at English and maths. That seems a good thing, but sometimes only by doing a policy can you work out if it is effective. Now, there is an elephant in the room, and it seems only right that I should address it, which is, of course, grammar schools. I am not going to tell you what I think about grammar schools. I am a civil servant. The only person who is allowed to ask me what I think is the minister. So when we come to Q&A, it is no good you're saying to me, so what do you think? Or what would you do? If you want to ask me that question, you need to stand for Parliament, you need to get elected, and you need to be selected by the Prime Minister to the job as a minister in my department. At that point, I will answer your question and not before. Those are the civil service rules. So, you will also realise I did not write the Prime Minister's speech. The Prime Minister's speech was written by the Prime Minister's team, and similarly and usefully, I haven't read the green paper that Nick Gibb announced will be launched on Monday. And that's very useful, because it means if I say something that turns out to be in the green paper, I have not leaked it, because I haven't seen it. Believe me, for a civil servant on a public platform being videoed and being viewable live around the world, that is extremely useful. Now, let's think about the Prime Minister's speech, which I have read in some detail. So first of all, she set out her aim. She wants to make Britain a country, she wants to create a truly meritocratic Britain that puts the interests of ordinary working class people first. It's useful when politicians say what they want to achieve, because we then have a standard against which we can judge whether their policies are evidence-based. So that's a good start. She also acknowledged that the evidence base is contested. She said, people get lost in the argument about whether the grammar schools of the 50s and 60s improve social mobility or not. And I think that's a fair and reasonable thing to say. There are people on all sides of this particular debate, and it's fair to say there is evidence on all sides of the debate, and the Prime Minister has acknowledged that. She then made a number of very specific claims, which, again, we can discuss. The first one, she said, is that affluent children are disproportionately likely to get great results and disproportionately likely to get to top universities. That is slam dunk true. Slam dunk is a technical term I use as chief analyst. It has a very important statistical meaning. Nobody would contest that statement is evidence-based. She then said that we have today selection by income, that those who are rich can go to private schools, those who are rich can afford to buy a house in the catchment area of a school that is outstanding. We know that's true. We know that houses next to good schools are more expensive, both because they're larger and because they command a higher price per square foot. So she has correctly identified something that is true. She pointed out that it's not much good saying to people who are on relatively low incomes, well, you could just move. That is not good enough, and I think she's right to say that. She also noted if you're earning £19,000, £20,000, £21,000 a year, you're not rich. That seems pretty true as well. That's, as a household income, that is below average. She talked about how, at the moment, there is no way to differentiate between the school experience of children from these families, these are children who are not on the pupil premium, and children from the wealthiest 10%. Again, that is substantively true. The performance tables do not distinguish between that group and rich children. They separate out pupil premium children, and maybe some of that group were in the pupil premium if they were previously unemployed, but clearly the Prime Minister's statement is substantively correct. We look at pupil premium children and all other. So it is legitimate for a democratic government to say we want a particular focus on this group of children. Then if we as citizens do not agree with that judgment, we can vote for a different party at the election. That's how democracy works. And I don't know about you, but I'm really pleased I live in a democracy. I'm really pleased I don't live in a technocracy or a dictatorship. And democracy works by politicians doing something and then the voters judging them. She then went on to say that free school meal children at grammar schools do well. And again, you can look at the evidence, and that is true. She then noted that grammar schools are much more likely to be rated outstanding by Ofsted. I believe the figure is 80% of grammar schools are currently rated outstanding, and I notice the head of Ofsted nodding in the audience, so I'll take that as a citation. I'm an academic, I like to cite someone, I cite Sean for that figure. She said that grammar schools want to expand. Again, that is a true statement. Any number of grammar schools wish to expand. So there is an evidence base for expanding grammar schools. They want to. The children who go there from poor backgrounds and middling backgrounds do well. Ofsted says they're good schools. She also said that we know that grammar schools are hugely popular with parents. And again, the opinion poll data suggests that that's true. This is, to be fair, of all adults, but there have been a number of surveys, BMG, YouGov, etc. These are the BMG figures in the last month. In terms of reported plans to increase the number of grammar schools, do you strongly support, neither, oppose, strongly oppose? 40% of people answer neither. Of the remainder, those who support outnumber those who oppose by 3-1. That's a big, big gap. So she is correct to say that this is a popular policy. 60% of people agreed that grammar schools help children from less well-off backgrounds achieve greater academic success. Only 13% of people disagreed with that statement. Whichever way you cut it, Labour voters, Liberal Democrat voters were least keen on that, but even then, 50% of Liberal Democrat voters believe that grammar schools help children from less well-off backgrounds achieve success. Socioeconomic characteristics, political leanings, you're getting majorities on every single way. And these are perfectly fair questions. These are not leading questions. They've all met the British Polling Council definition of how to do a good poll. And for those who oppose grammar schools, and I know there are many at this conference, I've sensed the vibe in earlier sessions, shall we say, I think you need to ask yourself a question as to why, if your views are sincerely held and you hold a stronger evidence base than the one that I have outlined, why have you not been successful in persuading people of that? And here, dare I say it, the role model is a man called Paul Collier. Professor of Development Economics in Oxford, author of a book called The Bottom Billion. I went to the launch of that book, and Paul said something along the following lines. This is the 13th book I've written. It's the first book I wrote that's designed to be read. All the other books, like A True Academic, were written to be a line on a CV. This one was written to be read, because he said people in Britain are calling for development policies that are stupid, that they believe, in all sincerity, will help people in poorer countries, but they won't. And he said, if I can get people to read this book on the beach, they will then write to their MP and call for more sensible policies, and MPs are more likely to campaign for sensible policies. So I say to those of you that believe that a move to grammar schools will be the wrong outcome, you need to think not just about changing government's view, but about changing the view out there. Politicians do not, by and large, do things that nobody wants to happen. Theresa May acknowledged that there are very few free school meal kids in grammar schools. She was open about that. About 2.5% of children in grammar schools are on free school meals, compared with about 12.5% for children of secondary school age in their localities. It's no good comparing with the national figure. It's not reasonable to expect a Buckinghamshire grammar school to have the same number of free school meals kids as a school in Knowsley. There just aren't that many free school meal kids in Buckinghamshire. Grammar schools are disproportionate in the south, so the national figure is not a fair basis. But there is a big difference, and the Prime Minister acknowledged that. That's why she's spoken about the need for new grammar schools to be much more active in taking more children from poorer backgrounds. The details, as Nick Gibbs said, will be announced on Monday in a green paper, and all of us need to wait and see what that says before we rush to judge the government on its proposals. But Theresa May was very clear as well that she was expecting more of existing grammar schools, expecting more of private schools. This was not a simple speech that said grammar schools are good and we should have more of them. She was absolutely adamant she did not want to return to the system of the past, and we'll see on Monday how she plans to ensure that that is not the outcome. Existing grammars will be expected to do more too. Those words, there will be flesh on them on Monday. It will be interesting to see how grammar schools respond to those words, but those are the Prime Minister's words. Finally, I want to highlight a prediction made by the Prime Minister. Now, predictions, of course, are always risky, but on this I am confident the Prime Minister is right. Her prediction is, I know that this, the grammar school plans, will be the source of much debate in the consultation over the coming months. I think we can all agree that that prediction is likely to be proven true. And I want to say to you, all of you in this room, as I said earlier, these consultations are not sham consultations. We in the DFE and we in government listen to what people say. We listen most when they're reasoned. We listen most when they're evidence-based. We listen least when people just write a diatribe, and we listen not at all when people simply insult the motives of the politicians concerned. I have never met a politician in education who wanted anything other than the best for our children. People in the current government, the previous government, people in opposition. So if you want to influence government, accept that we all want the same thing. Start from that point. Write your comments in an orderly, evidence-based and respectful fashion. That is the only sensible way to have a decent debate between government and civil society, a debate we all want, because when that debate works, ministers are more evidence-led than they are at other times. I'm going to stop there and take questions. If when you asked a question you could say who you are, that would be appreciated, and if you could speak clearly, because certainly for the people at the back, you're an awfully long way away. I'm not sure if they left this big gap for a particular reason, but I noticed nobody threw anything at me, so that's a good start. I'm happy to take, well, anything south of physical violence, to be honest. Bouquets, brickbats, comments, questions, whatever you want to ask, now is your time to do so. So that's a very good question, one to which I have absolutely no idea, because I am chief analyst, but as a job share. And prevent comes under my job share partner. So if Donna was standing here next to me, she would be able to answer your question. But she isn't, and I can't. So all I can do is be honest and say, I haven't got a clue, and I'm sorry about that. Hopefully I'll do better with the next question. That question, if we have decided that, that will be in the Green Paper on Monday. But again, that's the sort of question that the answer to that will only be known once we've gone through the consultation. I mean, what we know at the moment is the percentage varies dramatically around the country. I live in Kingston in southwest London. We have the Tiffin schools. They take a very low percentage of people from a very big catchment. I grew up in Chatham, where grammar schools, I guess, are something close to a third of the population. So grammar schools cover a broad range, and that is exactly the sort of question that it makes sense to provide the government with evidence on in the consultation responses.
I'm glad you mentioned Tiffin, because on their website it says no additional preparation is needed for this test. So I sent my son when he was 11 to take the Tiffin test. He was well below average in the test, and when he was there, we met young people who'd been 3 weeks out in year 6 in primary school doing test papers. He's now absolutely on top of his class and very high achieving comprehensive in central London. And I find it interesting that the evidence presented doesn't take account of the fact of, say, the proportion of young people who go to university now, which is 50%. And I just, to me, this essentially is 100% of children in grammar school. That's marvellous, and the head teachers we can all balance our budgets. But somewhere between 0 and 100, I worry.
So there are children who start practicing for the Tiffin test long before year 6, I can assure you. I've known children in year 4 who are going to crammer colleges to try and pass Tiffin tests. What we don't have is any good evidence as to whether that sort of cramming school actually makes a difference in terms of passing the exams. I do know people who've got into Tiffin without any private tuition or practice. And indeed, the person who sets the Tiffin exam is sitting on the row in front of you, because I think they're set by NFER, are they not? No, not anymore, I'm sorry. I thought Carol set them, and I was going to say you can talk to Carol afterwards. But Carol and NFER do set some of the 11 plus exams, and I know not anymore. There, she's pulled out of that market. Not since you've been there. And actually, there is a big literature on what constitutes a good and a bad test. So we know that some of the tests are more prone to selecting on socioeconomic status than others. And again, that's the sort of stuff that needs to be discussed in the consultation. Yes, in the back, in the middle.
Hi, Thomas Byrne, a new starter at the DFE.
Strange but true.
So, future policy, do you know if there's much evidence on different types of schools within the same match? Because with the announcement that's happened, one of the things that sort of sprung into my mind is you could have maths where there's a inclusive primary,
Yep.
all the way up until 14. And then you have the grammar, and then you've got UTC, University Technical College, in all within the same maths,
Yep.
all sort of working together. So when you do have different types of school in a maths, is there evidence that works?
So there are some maths that cover the full range. I mean, the extreme example, I guess, would be... so the question was about, are there examples of maths that cover the full range of different types of school, and does this work? So the most extreme case that I know of is the United Learning Trust, because that includes private and public schools, so fee-paying and non-fee-paying. They have primary schools and secondary schools, and they cover the entire nation. The Haberdasher Asks Federation also has private and state schools. I'm not aware of any MAT that has a UTC and a grammar school. And if there are any, there would only be 1 or 2, which makes it hard to deduce whether it's the type of school or whether it's the particular school chain is effective or ineffective. But yes, that is the sort of work that we in DFE will be doing to inform government policy over the next months and years. Absolutely, because it's a good sort of analysis to run. And we have those data. Thanks to the National Pupil Database, we have good evidence about which children do well, background characteristics, etc. So we can answer questions like that. David, in fact, two Davids.
David Weston from the Teacher Development Trust. So I'm interested that you noted that the paper's coming out on Monday, and that will be the first time you've seen it. At what point in the process of creating a green paper and then a white paper would you typically be consulted to look at the evidence base?
So analysts have been consulted for sure. It's just that I personally have not. So the team has been led... The way analysts are in clumps, and each policy area has a clump of analysts. The chief analyst is, to some extent, a managerial role. So there is no reason to think that because I haven't seen it, the policy making has not been evidence-based. So this has been led by Ian Bell's team because they're in the Education Standards Directorate. So they have been in with the Secretary of State and others and advising policy colleagues. So, sorry, I really don't want to give the impression that it's been evidence-free until now. There are a lot more analysts than just me in the DFE, I can promise you.
We haven't seen the green paper, but we have seen the back page of Jonathan Slater's memo, and that talks about trying to develop an evidence base. And I wonder if you were going to develop a trial for grammar schools, what sort of trial you might put in place to evaluate this policy?
Well, I think it depends on how you see grammar schools as working. If you want to create grammar schools that look exactly like current grammar schools, then by and large you look at Kent. And particularly Kent east of the River Medway is a pretty solidly grammar school area. There's the odd comprehensive in Kent. The Hundred of Who Peninsula, because it's very rural, has a comprehensive. There's a Catholic comprehensive in Medway. But overall, the system is fairly much a grammar school area, so you can look at Kent. But of course, Kent isn't typical of the whole of the country, in that Kent, you have different levels of immigration, you have different things like that in different parts of the country. So you can't say that Kent is a perfect summary, but that's where I'd start from. But it's clear the Prime Minister is talking about grammar schools in a different way to the way they operate in Kent. She wants them to be much more integrated into the broader education system. And again, when we see those plans in more detail, we and you can then come up with examples where that has happened, and you can tell us whether you think they work, and we can decide whether we think they work. And Nick Gibb was pretty unambiguous on this platform earlier, saying if the evidence shows the policy will be harmful, he will have no hesitation in saying to his bosses that he does not think this is the right thing to do. And that was a good instinctive answer from someone who looks at evidence.
Another element of government policy where there has been some dispute over the evidence is whether academy status leads to school improvement. It's something that ministers claim a lot, that children are doing better in schools in England because of the Academies programme, and that's been disputed, especially the latest work of the Education Policy Institute about whether sponsored academies are doing that job, especially the ones that have opened under the coalition government. I'm interested in your take. What is your take on the evidence at this stage? Is it inconclusive, or is it as ministers say?
So the question is the evidence for academies strong? So first of all, every ministerial speech is fact-checked. Every single line will have been signed off by the analysts as acceptable. If they are not acceptable, it is Andrew Dilnot's job as head of the UK Statistics Authority to write to ministers and say, "Hello, sunshine, you shouldn't say that." And Andrew is not a trivial figure. He is Sir Andrew Dilnot, he is well known. That is not something ministers take lightly. So be very clear. Everything ministers have said has passed that check. The evidence for the early academies, I think, is increasingly clear that they were successful. The Labour era, the Adonis era academies, I think we are now in a position where the overwhelming bulk of people say those worked. The children do better, and it's actually the children who were there before. We do things like sibling studies to correct for family background. Those children are more likely to go to university and so on and so forth. So there is an evidence base for academies. Those were easy to assess because there weren't many of them. So we had a really good control group. Now, if you read the technical detail of Steve Machin et al.'s most recent paper, which I have read, because I'm the sort of guy who starts with the tables, I'm chief analyst, then what he says is it's very hard to assess the most recent academies because actually we're running out of a counterfactual group. There aren't that many local authority schools left, and the ones that are tend to be local authority for some sort of reason. So his conclusion is that we no longer are able to say clearly whether those schools have worked. Now then, of course, the question is, what is the aggregate? So the aggregate is they're a group who have succeeded, and they're a group about whom we can't say. In that context, I think Nick Gibbs' statement earlier that academies have worked is a legitimate and defensible position. I can imagine you could come up with some different legitimate and defensible positions. You can certainly say that not every academy has worked, and Nick Gibb would not deny that. Nobody would claim that an academy is a magic bullet or that every academy works, any more than opponents of academies would claim that every local authority school has worked. There is obviously a distribution there.
Thanks very much for the clarification around evidence reform and evidence creating. In an evidence creating scenario, often that's turned out third parties are often involved, and often you have, if you were to correlate methodology rigor with relevance, often methodology is not so sound, but relevance is high, and then you get social media that turns it into populism through the headlines. So coming back to influencing the public, it's not often based on a sound evidence base, but actually populist views. So I just wanted to kind of take your take on that, really, that there is that other angle to that.
Oh, absolutely. And that's why today on Twitter, Becky Allen, who's here, and Chris Cook, who's not, have been in a Twitter discussion on whether Chris Cook can get, even on Newsnight, the phrase, "This is a graph of the residuals from the regression." And I think Becky Allen has offered him a tenner if he is willing to utter those words on television. Let's be honest, you can, even on a programme like Newsnight, you're unlikely to get something with a logarithmic scale. I mean, the ability of the general public, even on a programme like that. But that's why I'm really proud that we have great journalists in Britain, whether it's Chris Cook on Newsnight or Laura McInerney here, who really engage. Schools Week is a good newspaper. It really engages with the evidence, and that's the point of the media. Of course, there are people on Twitter who we shouldn't bother following because we know what they're going to say irrespective of the evidence. Just don't follow them. All it does is raise your blood pressure. I don't want any of you to die an early death, and some of the people on Twitter on all sides seem to me to be risking the mental health of themselves and others. And I say that in all seriousness. That is not a cheap joke about mental health. One thing we know about mental health at the moment is that social media is not being consistently helpful on mental health. And that's why, I'm on Twitter. I'm at Tim Leunig, for those who want to follow me. There are people out there who, they're really not the people who are influencing ministers, I promise you. Ministers are interested in much more serious people than that. Yep.
Opinion. And much, I think, has to be made of the questions that are asked. And I was just wondering if you could highlight how the government goes about commissioning polls and whether at all you do consider to ask the questions in an alternative way to get a truer version of what actually people think. Because I'll give the example, and it's would you send your child to a grammar school if they pass the 11 plus? The ubiquitous answer that most parents are going to say is yes, because they want the best for their children and grammar schools to have a good reputation for results. The inverse, though, is if your child failed the 11 plus, how would you feel about them going to the local conference?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me stop you there, because it's not the government who... Sorry, the question was, how does government go about... How do we do the phrasing for these opinion poll questions? We do not commission them in government. I can't think of any occasion that I'm aware of in which the DFE has commissioned an opinion poll like that. They're commissioned by either newspapers, pressure groups, interested bodies. For those of you who want to know, it's about 2,000 quid a question. So it's not hugely expensive. If you want to go out and do one, you can do one. Notice that I didn't choose to highlight the answers to the question, would you send your kid to a grammar school if they passed? Because that seems to me an utterly uninteresting question. I highlighted the ones that I chose about, do you think they should expand? Do you think that they help social mobility? Because I think those are interesting questions. The British Polling Council has rules on what sort of questions you're allowed to ask. So you're not allowed to say, if your kid is really bright and is really struggling in school and were given a chance to go to a much better school, which would change their life outcomes, would you want this? Because that's a useless question. It's an illegitimate question. And the British Polling Council wouldn't allow it. And they get things right and wrong. I think the last thing we'd want is the DFE dictating to the British Polling Council how they should phrase questions about grammar schools. That is a road I really wouldn't want to go down. But these are not government commissioned surveys. Absolutely not.
I wonder what you thought the right approach for policymakers to take is when the quality of the evidence isn't out there. So we know that generally there are lots of education evidence isn't good enough, and even the high quality stuff like randomised controlled trials, we know that the design of the trial actually determines to some extent the effect size. So how do you kind of respond when even the apparently good evidence out there is
So how do we improve the evidence? What do you do when the evidence is bad? So the best form of evidence is randomised controlled trials. And Ben Goldacre's work for DFE, 5 years ago now, was absolutely groundbreaking. The DFE's decision to spend £126 million as an endowment for the EEF was a brave decision, Minister. Michael Gove, I think, was the first person to endow an outside body over which he would have no control to run randomised controlled trials in schools. But it had to be independent of government, or schools would worry that we were bending the results. And it has to be an endowment so that whatever Kevin Collins finds out. So if Kevin Collins finds out and declares that phonics is the work of the devil and ruins children's lives, there's nothing DFE ministers can do about it. And what's more, everybody knows that if Kevin, he didn't find that, I hasten to add, for those of you listening at home, when he says something to the contrary, everybody knows that Kevin doesn't have in the back of his mind, oh no, I need to go for my grant renewal next year, I better not upset ministers. That endowment was a fantastic thing. Now, for randomised controlled trials, I think one thing we've learned from the work of the EEF is you need twice as big a sample as you think you need. There's the treatment group and the control group. But not all the treatment group end up actually getting the thing they're supposed to be tested. So the treated group, as it's called, technical lecture here, I am the chief analyst, I'm allowed to do this. The treated group is a subsection of the treatment group. And within the control group, some of them think, oh, that's a really good idea, I'm going to do it anyway. I mean, it's so frustrating when that happens. So you need a much bigger sample than you think. My other rule of thumb is when you get an effect size, that is likely to be the maximum effect size. Since all the evidence is, it's in Hardy and Cartwright's book on this sort of stuff, is that when it's done first time, everybody knows they're being looked at, and it causes them to work harder in other ways because they know they're going to be evaluated. The Hawthorne effect. So mentally, I halve the effect size of any result from an RCT, and that is my mental sense of what the final result will be. That is the best we can do. But of course, for some things, there will always be professional judgment. Any teacher in the classroom needs professional judgment. You have one individual child in front of you. You have to make a decision. It doesn't matter that an RCT says this works in 65% of cases. You've got to make a judgment as to whether there's something specific about that child. Phonics, the evidence is, works on average. You've taught a kid phonics, they're still not learning to read. You've got to decide whether teaching them phonics again is the right strategy, or whether for some reason this kid is just blanking phonics and you need to try something else. That is a decision only a professional can make in the classroom. Professional judgment is the bottom line at the end of the day. We can be evidence-informed, but not evidence-led. Now, I have 1 minute, and then I get cut off. Absolutely. Let me stop you there because I only have 1 minute. The question is, when do we look for unintended consequences? And the answer is immediately. We always sit down and think, and particularly we look abroad. So the Netherlands, for example, has a selective system. It's quite a good system. There are good selective systems and bad selective systems worldwide. And we will be looking exactly at that, because believe me, teacher recruitment and teacher retention is front and centre in ministers' minds. That's exactly the sort of thing we will look for, and we will look for straws in the wind in advance As the policy gets developed, do we notice? We know exactly how many people click on the Get Into Teaching website every single day. So if we notice a drop, then we found something. If we don't notice a drop, we will continue. That's how we can judge that adverts are expensive. The day after we have a television advert, more people click on the site. The best programme turns out to be Countdown. Countdown is watched by students after lectures and before they go out in the evening. Programmes at the hour that Countdown is on. And all of those programmes, whatever they're on, are the best time to advertise, we have discovered. The adverts are relatively cheap, so when students watch television, we get the kick up the next day. And that sort of evidence on whether people are registering for teachers is day by day and allows us to look at exactly those unintended consequences because they are critical, and you are absolutely right to highlight it. Now, I'm being told that I'm out of time. Thank you for coming. Please do engage with us on this, because the more evidence we have, the more likely we are to make a good decision. And that is what everybody in government, out of government, parents and teachers want. So please, I ask you, engage with us. Thank you.